Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, hello today on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I'm your host today for the Millennial Roundtable. My name is Chelsey Youman, and I'm here to discuss so many current events we have going on, especially around Texas. We are in full session. If you are a Texan paying attention, we have so much politics going on right now amidst the COVID crisis and our energy crisis, and the Senate has certainly been moving on the abortion issues. So we're going to be talking about all of that Texas politics here at the beginning. But before we get there, I'm here with Liberty McArtor. She is a freelance writer. She works with First Liberty Institute, also writes for Point of View. So thank you for joining us today, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsey. It's great to be here. Excited about the topics today.
Thank you. We have, there's a lot to discuss. We've got culture, politics, and then, of course, a little bit later in the show, we'll get to some of those federal issues you've heard in the pipeline, like tax increases for infrastructure, what all that infrastructure really means when you break it down and take a look. So more on the way. But here in the first hour, Liberty and I are going to start with the Texas abortion bills that sailed through the Senate, really in a historic way. I would say the most pro-life Senate movement we have seen in decades occurred in the last month. And so I personally work, I'm the Texas State Director with Human Coalition Action, and we are a pro-life advocacy group. So I've been working session and am certainly, I'm a little sleep deprived. We'll say it that way, Liberty. It's been a wild ride, but really an exciting one. So let's start there. The Texas Senate had tons and tons, dozens of pro-life bills filed. Members are really excited and motivated to protect lives this election cycle. I think we heard so much about the blue wave throughout the general election, and that Californians are moving here in droves, which they are, and that the blue wave was going to occur, but we actually didn't lose a single legislative seat in the Texas. There were a few swap outs, but for the most part, we kept a really, really solid Republican majority. And I think that the members, the senators and House members have responded in a way to that calling. They said, okay, you guys are electing us for a reason. We're going to rise to the occasion. And they did something that is not typically done. They heard all the major pro-life bills in one day. Wow. So typically each bill will get its own hearing. You have a couple days to prepare. If you're like us, we're supporting multiple of these bills. We carted down like 8 people to come testify in one day. And it was really exciting and really festive. I was actually hoping for a few protesters in the mix to keep things exciting, but no, they really didn't show up. Planned Parenthood is nowhere to be found. No one opposing these bills is anywhere to be found. It's truly what I've been calling the voice for the voiceless at the Capitol in Texas. And then all of those went to floor for debate on Monday and were finally voted on yesterday. And so that's a little bit of the background. Liberty, what do you think about that? I know that some of that is a little bit insider information or isn't always published, but are you surprised to hear it's such a pro-life session?
I would say I'm very encouraged and thankful for like the organizations that you work for and the kind of work that you're doing, because this is just so exciting. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Texas is traditionally a conservative leader, and they're really, setting an example right now with these pro-life bills. But I would say, typically, and I may be wrong, but I feel like from the things that I've read and researched, like the pro-life movement really kicks into gear whenever there is an administration that is very pro-abortion. And so even, during the Obama years, and obviously there was a lot of, pro-abortion activity happening, federally or support for abortion there was a lot of progress at the state levels with pro-life bills being passed. And so when you said there was no protesters, obviously we don't know the reason for that, but I thought that was interesting because I wonder if people on the pro-choice side are thinking, well, we have an abortion-friendly administration now, things are going to be looking up for us, and definitely there are battles to fight, but the pro-life movement is saying, well, we're not taking a break. In fact, we're kicking into high gear. And if we may actually see a lot of pro-life progress, at least in the conservative states like Texas, because people are really, ready to fight right now. So that's what I'm wondering.
That's such an interesting point that you raised, Liberty. And I love that you're thinking through those things. I did notice that Planned Parenthood was tweeting about a lot of the bills. They're tweeting. And then one thing they did say is because of COVID, they didn't want to be out and about. And, we're in a generation that I think as millennials, often they think it's enough. If you just voice your opinion, they act like that's the same as a vote. And it's really not. The members are there to hear from the public. Our Capitol is open. It is robust. It's bursting at the seams now. I mean, I think it was a little bit quiet at the beginning, but, they're certainly willing to tweet about it, but not really advocate. And on the other side, you're so right. Our base is really, really motivated. It really brings up two thoughts. The first being that most pro-life accomplishments are done at the state level. I mean, this is where it's done. So if it's not happening here, that would be a real problem. But also that the Biden administration has already in his first few days of office that he's had been extremely damaging on the life issue, openly funding refunding abortion abroad through repealing the Mexico City ban and saying, okay, international organizations who fund abortion can now get funding again. They passed the first bill in 40 years that didn't have a Hyde Amendment provision, which means that our taxpayer dollars in their most recent stimulus package, millions of those dollars are going to go towards abortion and abortion entities. So there's a lot they're really being aggressive on. And I think that raises a broader point for me in that we saw so many Christians really grappling with that question of their vote and the life issue. And we had evangelical, I don't know if we should call them evangelical, but like conservative commentators on the right or Baptist leaders on the right, leaders in the Christian conservative movement coming out with articles saying, well, the presidency really doesn't impact abortion rates that much, and, kind of twisting some of the facts I thought at the time. Now, granted, that's my issue, so I'm an expert at those facts, but they really, I thought, misled a lot of the Christian base who is struggling with their conscience on whether to vote for Trump or what do I do. And for those Christians who are grappling then, I would say now the answer to you is yes, it's been extremely damaging for life. And more lives are being lost. The abortion movement is more funded than ever because of the Biden administration. And we now know that those votes for the Biden administration actively impact life, which on the flip side, what you're alluding to, which is at the state level, we're seeing some motivated Republicans answer the call there. We are going to go to a break here in a few minutes, but when we get back, we'll unpack these bills. We'll go through some of them, what they mean for Texans, what they mean for unborn Texans, and hopefully the lives that are going to be saved from them. And of course, you can read about these bills or more on pointofview.net or watch live at Point of View Radio on Facebook. You can see our faces there. Feel free to comment. We see those. I'll try to respond to any questions you ask there. And if you have any commentary or things you'd like to add to our discussion today, call the line at 800-351-1212. And then Liberty, when you get back, she's going to stay with us a little bit later in the hour. We'll have Ben Courson joining us, as well as Jonathan Teague with Prestonwood Baptist Church, who you guys are very familiar with. They're always on the Millennial Roundtable, and they're going to be with us just a little bit later. So stay tuned. More to discuss about Texas politics, federal politics, no shortage of issues. And when we get back after this break, thanks.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
There was a time in the past when political leaders of both parties talked about the importance of religion in the founding of this country. Terry Jeffrey found a speech by an urban Northeastern Democrat that illustrated this so well. The candidate proclaimed that a devotion to fundamental religious principles has characterized American thought and action. He argued that the nation's greatest leaders understood the essential religious idea of our founding. Our earliest legislation was inspired by this deep religious sense. Our first leader, Washington, was inspired by this deep religious sense, and Lincoln was inspired by this deep religious sense, he continued. Then his speech turned to a warning. He sensed that the very principles on which the nation was founded were being attacked. He warned that these basic religious ideas are challenged by atheism and materialism, at home in the cynical philosophy of many of our intellectuals, abroad in the doctrine of collectivism, which sets up the twin pillars of atheism and materialism as the official philosophical establishment of the state. Near the end of the speech, he said, "We cannot assume that the struggle is ended. It is never ending. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It was the price yesterday, it is the price today, it will ever be the price." This was a rousing speech about liberty and religious ideals delivered by an urban Northeastern Democrat who also warned that we faced a struggle from secular materialistic enemies here and abroad. How did this candidate do after giving such a speech? Well, he was first elected to Congress and later elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 years later, he was elected President of the United States. His name was John F. Kennedy. His speech back then wasn't that controversial. It was even prophetic. But I doubt it would be permitted in today's Democrat Party. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable. I'm joined here today by Liberty McArtor, and we're breaking down all of the pro-life movement we're seeing at the state level in Texas. It's been a very active season. One I'm saying is probably the most pro-life session we've seen in at least a decade, maybe even longer than that, although I wouldn't remember all the way back then. But we saw just a host of pro-life bills heard early on. It's one of the fastest issues they're making sure to address. It's a priority of Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. He had 2 pro-life bills on his top 30 priority list. Governor Abbott really requested at the beginning of session that the pro-life issue be addressed. And as someone working this session in the pro-life movement for Human Coalition Action, at the beginning of session, I was a little concerned because I thought, man, we have so many issues to compete with. There's COVID. Don't forget redistricting. It's a redistricting year. Then the energy crisis hit with the horrible snowstorm that came through. And so really it was really a sense of urgency about disaster after disaster in our state. But of course, to me, this is the greatest disaster. And the left is making much of that and saying, why are you addressing abortion when you have COVID? People are dying. COVID is active. And I just thought, well, people in the womb are dying at 58,000 a year. 58,000 preborn children are aborted a year in Texas alone. And so I'm very excited to see our Senate rise to the occasion. They've voted off the floor this week 7 pro-life bills. They're headed on to the House. So you guys stay tuned. Congratulate your senators if they are Republicans voting for this bill. Thank them for their hard work and leadership. And then figure out who your House sponsors are and ask them to sponsor these pro-life bills and make sure they continue to move through session because it's not done yet. Let's highlight a few of these bills, though. The first being SB 8. Senate Bill 8 is the fetal heartbeat bill for Texas, and that bill is sponsored by Senator Hughes. We were really honored to work with Senator Hughes and his incredible team, highly intellectual, strong conservative team he has surrounded himself with on this bill. And this bill does not disappoint. So 11 other states have passed heartbeat bills, and 11 other states' heartbeat bills have been enjoined. Heartbeat bills essentially say once a child in the womb has a detectable heartbeat through just basic medical sonograms or however audio that is discovered, at that point the baby is protected. Its chances of being born alive and healthy are in the 90 percentile, and so saying really viability would be really strong for children with a heartbeat. So that any heartbeat is worth protecting, any human is worth protecting, even those before they have their heartbeat. But this bill would scale it back to there. But it's different. It's a unique heartbeat bill, and one, as my lawyer nerd came out when I read these bills and worked on them, I don't think the heartbeat bill can easily be challenged in court, and that is because there's no state enforcement. So the state isn't going to knock on the door of the abortion providers. There's no enforcement by any state official. How is it enforced then? How will we make sure these abortion providers don't conduct abortions? It's private citizens. It's private citizens like you and me and the unborn child's mother who can sue abortion providers for illegally conducting abortions after a heartbeat. And because of that, the state of Texas can't be enjoined from this bill going forward. Abortion providers will be charged $10,000 a child. And so it should hopefully, I'm hoping it cripples the abortion industry because they have to now take on this risk. Do they conduct abortions after 6 weeks and risk incurring fines and civil penalties in court? So it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. I think it's a really unique opportunity to challenge Roe specifically because in Texas, you may not know that if you're listening and you're an abolitionist. This is the number one thing I tell abolitionists because, of course, ideally, abortion is abolished from our communities. It has been a stain in America on our history, but the pre-Roe abortion laws are still on the books. And I don't know if you know that. They were enacted that criminalize and say abortion is homicide. And so just like any other crime, that's how they would be prosecuted. They have just not been enforced since Roe was decided. And so this bill reiterates that and says those laws were never repealed. They're still on the books. They're still enforceable. I think it works as a civil abolition bill. So those are the two things I'll highlight about SB 8, our heartbeat bill. Liberty, I don't know if you had a chance to review it or really think through it, but what are your initial thoughts?
Well, like you said, I feel like the heartbeat bills are so powerful because they do take effect as far as in terms of fetal development so early on. I'm actually 6 months pregnant right now. So I've been going through the, prenatal appointments and all that stuff. And so it's very recent in my mind. And when you get your at-home pregnancy test and then you call your doctor and say, I would like to come in and, they schedule you for 6 or 8 weeks or whatever. That very first appointment, you hear the baby's heartbeat. And so it happens so early on, which is just, another thing that we can celebrate thanks to technological advancements and the more that we know about, in the womb now. And like you said, there really is a strong argument for viability after that point. The baby is likely going to be healthy. There's no reason to abort that baby. There's no reason to abort a baby at all. But, it just goes to show that at that point, the child has there's no denying that there is a child in there with a healthy heartbeat. So I think these heartbeat bills are great. And I think it's really interesting that, the way you explained it, because even for me, not being a lawyer, reading about it, I'm like, okay, so exactly how is this going to work? But I think this gives citizens the opportunity to be very vigilant and, to say you have a part to play in helping to make sure that this law is enforced and to protect these babies, after their heartbeat is detected.
Absolutely. And even if you were not interested in joining a lawsuit against an abortion provider, once this bill's enacted, maybe you could pay the attorney's fees for attorneys who do want to to do the lawsuit, right? And nonprofits who want to sue abortion providers, this would be a great way to stop abortionists in their tracks. But, there's going to be legal fees involved. And so thinking through your role as a citizen to help protect life right now, it's really in your hands. You have an opportunity to participate in saving lives in a way that's never been possible before. So really keep your eye on SB 8. It's headed over to the House. Again, Senator Hughes was the author of that bill. So call his office, thank him. Also call your House representative and let them know, hey, we want to see the movement on this bill. We want it to go to committee hearings, et cetera. Although we have really pro-life members on the House too. So no pushback there. The other bill that I really want to highlight for our listeners is what we've been referring to as the Every Mother Matters Act. Emma, it is a human coalition action bill, by the way, so I should disclaimer that I advocated specifically for this bill, so I'm really passionate about it. We hear a lot of heat and frankly misleading information from the left that we're pro-life but not pro-birth, or maybe our movement isn't serving women the way they should, and we know that to be false. We know PRCs, pregnancy resource centers, outnumber abortion clinics, like I think 10 to 1 almost. So the church is active in assisting women and helping women. But Emma, the Every Mother Matters Act is the bill that says before women have abortions, they can contact a nonprofit organization for free and get help, whatever help they want. If it's domestic violence, safe housing, employment, you name it, the list was broad. And they can say, hey, can we come alongside you in this dire need you might be facing and do something to alleviate those circumstances, in the hopes that women and their health will benefit. So it includes connecting them with gynecological care early on, postpartum screening. The care lasts for 2 years, regardless of birth outcome. It includes a human trafficking screen. So a whole host of benefits for women that are tangible, meeting them where they're at and really addressing the underlying reason there's a demand for abortion. And then also in the hopes that lives will be saved. We estimate around 20,000 lives conservatively could be saved every year. That's 1,000 kindergarten classrooms a year coming into schools because we're just meeting mothers where they are. Senator Paxton carried that bill, but also it's headed to the House where Representative Leach is the sponsor of that bill. So any initial analysis for us, Liberty, on Emma?
I love this bill, and you've talked about it on the show before, and I just think it's great because if you look at the statistics of why most women abort, it really, I think you hear these loud advocates for abortion of shout your abortion, and that really doesn't represent the average woman. A lot of times it comes down to a lack of knowledge about what happens in the womb. It comes down to lack of resources. Women who maybe already have children and they're worrying about how can I care for these kids that I already have? Maybe they don't have support from their partners. And so, or maybe they're in an abusive situation. And so there are all these real world concerns that don't justify abortion. But if we're not willing to address those as the pro-life community, we're not giving mothers the help that they need. So I love the fact that this bill does that. And you really, no pro-choice person or advocate can argue that we're not trying to help women, through every stage of life. We're saying, no, we are helping you. We want to get rid of all the concerns that would make you even consider abortion and show you that we're going to walk you through this difficult time in your life.
Well, believe it or not, the Democrats came out swinging on the floor against this bill. I could not, it was so absurd. I couldn't follow the logic because they were saying, we need Texas to fund more resources for women, but we're going to vote about how against women getting that access. It's wild to me. It was not logical. But you guys contact Representative Leach and show your support. Senator Paxton, it's going to really help nonprofits and women everywhere across the state of Texas. Stay tuned. When we get back, we'll talk about the border. So much to talk about there.
Okay, yes, I need to read that.
Point of view is reaching this often overly
The border
plugged in
crisis?
generation with
Okay,
truth.
I'll also
You
pull
can
up.
keep
I'm
up
gonna
with
grab
us
a coffee,
24
though.
Okay.
hours a
Do you
day
want
using your
anything?
phone.
I'm
your
good.
laptop,
I've got my
or
water.
desktop,
Thank
or
you.
your
Feeling
desktop.
okay?
For
Yes.
the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and I'm joined by Liberty McArtor. She is a freelance writer with First Liberty Institute and Point of View. Always has such a refreshing a refreshing opinion and perspective on the show. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chelsey. It's very nice. It's great to be here today.
We have unpacked how much is going on at the Texas legislature, especially on the abortion issue and just how pro-life our leaders really are. And it's been an exciting session, especially for me as I'm in the pro-life movement, to see all of that going down. But there's also a lot going on in Texas. If you move south of Austin to the border, there is a lot here. So we would actually love if you're a caller listening and you are living in the South and you're seeing or being impacted by this humanitarian crisis and the border crisis that's going on. Please call our number. Tell us what you're seeing. Tell us what you're witnessing. Call 800-351-1212. We would love to hear what's really going on the border, because what I will definitely be highlighting is what Biden doesn't want us to be talking about today, and that is how much of a humanitarian crisis we have on our hand and how much that's increased in the last few months since he took office. Many of our listeners know he actually said that until the conditions improved, he wasn't going to allow media down there to report on it. I think that sounds like a First Amendment violation. So I'm going to be using this platform to really talk about what's going on at the border. We need to know and be informed. It's been in dire straits for a few years. I think really the increase in migration started in 2019 from what I've read. So I do want to say that this happened before, and how President Trump handled the migration was he had them staying on the Mexico side of the border to seek asylum if they were there to seek asylum, because there is an immigration status in immigration law that provides for people who are essentially fleeing unlivable, dangerous, and dire circumstances. It's called seeking asylum, and it's a high legal standard to meet that threshold if you have to show you would face bodily injury or harm by being at home. And many of the migrants are facing that at home, with countries overrun. I've heard a lot of them are from Guatemala specifically, overrun by cartels. Their lives are threatened almost on a daily basis. They're facing a famine and a hunger crisis in those areas where the government has failed and succumbed to the cartels. So I don't want to paint with broad brushstrokes here. I want to be specific about some of the migrants that are coming across the border being asylum seekers. Well, when President Biden was elected, he changed the policy to allow them to stay on the U.S. side, and there has been a vast increase in migration since. So we're looking at, there was a border town of 10,000 they have tens of thousands of migrants flooding through. There are coyotes that help assist people getting as far from Guatemala or Central America through Mexico up to the border. They're called coyotes, and they're charging $3,500 an individual to get people here. So human trafficking is on the rise, and of course, unaccompanied minors who are sitting in these facilities are very vulnerable and susceptible to human trafficking, which our state senators really made sure to go down and discuss and say, look, this is going to have a negative impact on some of these individuals. But we're seeing thousands and thousands of kids. There's 750 in one facility that's overflowing. There's over 1,000 in a Dallas convention center that's overflowing, and they'll break them up by age and gender, trying to keep things safe for the children. They're getting 3 square meals a day from what I'm hearing. They do have blankets and cots, and so they'll be at the detention centers at least 10 days. But we're really facing something that has been a growing crisis over the last few months and that needs to be addressed. Liberty, what are your thoughts as you read about what all is going down at the border?
Well, I would say, I have 3 thoughts initially. First of all, to the point of President Biden not wanting the media to go down and cover the situation, my background is in journalism. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, if anybody tries to shut out the media, I always get really suspicious really fast because, our media, lacks a lot today. There's a lot to be desired. But at the same time, the free press is extremely important. And people need to realize that the border crisis is still going on. Democrats didn't magically fix it when they got elected. And that's it. That leads me to my second point, which is, we really have to dig deep. Speaking of biased media, when you hear things, see a post on social media, whether it's from one side or the other, or see a pundit on the news talking about one thing or the other, really dig deeper, because I think there were a lot of people who just believed that maybe Biden would make the immigration crisis better, be more compassionate. But this humanitarian crisis is still happening. And in fact, a lot of his policies are making it worse. So it's really important to stay informed and realize that, politicians are going to be hypocritical, and we're seeing that happening right now. And just reading this article from the Wall Street Journal, which I believe is posted on pointofview.net, talking about just how horrible it is for the people coming over the border. These policies are encouraging mothers with young children to try and cross the river, to try to make this dangerous journey when there is a threat of human trafficking, and the journey alone is dangerous. And you have human smugglers that are have no interest in trying to protect the safety of the people that they're smuggling, just, interest in getting money from it. It's not right to encourage them to make that journey. And I understand that some people have to flee the horrible conditions like you were talking about. But at the same time, we can't give them false promises and say, if you come here, we're going to give you this, this, and this, when that's not actually happening for them. And the journey itself is very dangerous. So it's just, there's a lot of stuff here, but those are my initial thoughts.
There is a lot to unpack here. And one being, I'll start by backing up and saying some specific statistics. We know how large, when we're saying crisis, it's not like a millennial hashtag we're using. It's 17,000 children alone in a detention center by Department of Homeland Security and local detention centers. And that's only for 10 days at a time. So that number is being replenished every 10 days. They don't know. They are releasing a lot of them into Texas, because I think after 10 days legally, they're required to do something with them. They're also sending a lot back across the border to Mexico and flying some back home. And so really, this is beginning to be a huge undertaking. I mean, what do we do with 17,000 children, unaccompanied minors at our border? They are children. They are human, regardless of how they got here, or why they got here. They are now here. And so we have to find a way to care for them and ensure their safety. I mean, we cannot have them in the hands of human traffickers. That trafficking is already on the rise, particularly in the year after COVID that we've had. And the I-35 corridor through Texas is a huge hotspot for traffickers. And so making sure these children don't end up as sex slaves is, I would say, a compelling state interest and community interest. So what are your thoughts in terms of where could we go from here as a policy stance? I'm not sure what all the Biden administration's even considering. Is it just release everybody? Is it continue to detain? I mean, is it send everyone home? What are your thoughts?
Goodness. There's not going to be any easy answer. And, as believers, we do care about these individuals. It doesn't matter, what country we're from. And I think we have to clarify, that this is really a human interest issue, like you were saying. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of the people who are inside our borders, especially the children who are here through no fault of their own. But I would say that we need to make sure that if people really are fleeing some of these dire situations down in Central and South America, that, America has always been a city on a hill and a beacon of light where people can come and find a new life. And I think that that's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, we have to realize that we're just one nation. We can't take care of everybody's problems, and that's not harsh. That's just reality. And so learning, finding a way to, identify the difference between people who are, really seeking a new life here, making sure that there is a path for them, versus people who maybe hear things, from politicians that they're going to get free this and free that if they make this journey. And really, that's not a fair thing to say, because you're causing these people to embark on something that's very dangerous and has all these risks. And when they get here, America is not delivering on those promises. So, I know that there have been immigration reform policies proposed by people a lot smarter than me on these issues. But it's, trying to find that balance is going to be really hard.
That raises a really interesting point on immigration reform, and something that I know has not been accomplished in the last few years. And one of the things we've heard on the right is that there's already policies on the books that should just be being enforced. And so when we get back after the break, let's continue to delve into that, continue to delve into what we as millennials think there could be solutions for here, see what are some things the administration could do and look at. And after that, we'll have later on in the show, Ben Courson will be joining us at the 1 o'clock hour, and we'll talk about evangelicals and Christians numbers decreasing in America in most recent years. So stay tuned and be back with us right after this break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your Millennial Roundtable host today, and I've got Liberty McArtor, and we are talking about the border crisis. It is an actual crisis, and from our millennial perspective, what do we do? There are at least 17,000 minors being detained every 10 days, and so this is a replenishing number, not a final number, but it's certainly becoming something that's escalating and problematic. And it's something I wanted to personally highlight on the show because we know that the media has been locked out of the border. It's not being reported what's going on down there. And so I think we have to get truth out regardless of a government who says, don't look, don't know what's going on down there. And so in line with that, if you are from a southern town in Texas and you're seeing an increase in immigration across our border, you're seeing some of the devastating, if you work at any of the detention centers and want to call, we would love to hear what's really going on. So 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. I did want to piggyback on something you were saying earlier, Liberty, which is, do we need immigration reform? It hasn't been done over the last few years. This crisis has been, I want to be intellectually honest here, it has been escalating since 2019, but there was certainly a surge that happened after the re-election, and that is because what Senator Courson, who is a Texas state senator, mentioned, 6 of the female senators from the state of Texas went down to the border and looked at the conditions, and they said, look, the children are getting 3 square meals a day. They've got blankets, they've got cots. So luckily, they're being fed by DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and their conditions are not abominable, but know that this is not where children belong, right? She projected that there would be 2 to 4 million immigrants when all of this is said and done after this surge. And so the wave is still coming. And one of the things she highlighted is communicating to other countries and other nations that are not just Mexico, by the way, it's Central America. And then I've heard that almost 40% are from the Caribbean, actually, which surprised me. Haiti specifically being a center where people are fleeing. They are seeking asylum because of dangerous conditions back home, which is a valid immigration status under our current law. We say a lot, we have laws they just need to be enforced. One of those is asylum seekers going through the process to seek asylum, and it's an evidentiary standard they have to meet before our immigration courts, and there's an ultimate determination. So there are laws that allow for this. It just needs to be done in a cohesive way that's not as crazy as it is right now. So she said really communicating to these other countries that we do not have an open border. There's not something that's open, perhaps moving the encampment back to the Mexico side of the border, which is what President Trump was doing, and President Biden moved them to our side of the border. Perhaps that would help slow the process. And then the third thing I thought of is maybe finding ways to allow these people to seek asylum from their home countries, and then granting asylum as soon as possible for people who are truly facing life and death situations. Those were just a few initial thoughts I had. I'm curious, Liberty, did you have any additional that came to mind for you?
This is not something that I am, very knowledgeable about, but I would say those things sound like good starting points to me. And one thing, even if you're not super knowledgeable about this issue, but it's a problem, then I would just encourage, all of us, myself included, to do the research on this and find out what policies, proposals at the state level, at a federal level, can we support to make sure that we are dealing with this crisis as a country, both in a humane way, especially for the people and particularly the children that are already here, and the people that are facing life and death situations, but in a practical way as well, because like you were saying, Chelsey, we can't just have an open border that's not sustainable. But from the millennial perspective, it is interesting, immigration has increased, particularly in our generations. And so I think, one thing that is interesting to note is that in our generation, and then the generation below us, Gen Z, is more racially diverse than previous generations. And a lot of that reason is because we do have more immigration populations coming here. And so, that's not a bad thing at all. But it changes the dynamic, I think, of how millennials see this crisis. I think you have a lot of people in our generation, a lot of our peers who are immigrants themselves, and have a unique perspective on this as far as the kind of situations maybe that their families came from and their background and what it means to be in America and the difference. So I would also just, encourage my fellow millennials and people who are young adults, as we're trying to figure this out. There are a lot of different perspectives that can be really valuable in this, where we can find solutions. and talk with people who are our peers and who have maybe, been raised in America for several years, but they have this other background. They weren't born here or their parents came over. And so we need to get all those different kinds of perspectives, I think, to make sure that we find a solution that actually works over the long term.
Well, I love hearing your millennial perspective on the Millennial Roundtable on this issue, because you're so right. We have a really diverse state. I mean, we have a very culturally rich state. We have large Hindu, Muslim communities in our state. We have a large Latino community in our state. And it's something that you're right. Our schools are diverse. They're multicultural. I went to a school in the DFW area that had 40 languages spoken in the hallways, 40. So we do have a different perspective. It's not like immigration doesn't bother me. I think our country is beautiful because of immigration, and it allows people to have maybe a different life or freedoms that they otherwise wouldn't have. And especially for these asylum seekers, my heart really does go out to them when they're facing cartels overrunning their towns at home. And, the things they're describing back home is inability to get food, no protection from local law enforcement. So the last thing I would want is for them to stay in a place that their children, maybe here they're getting 3 square meals a day, but they're, they were facing death. But we also have to continue to think through things like we mentioned, human trafficking, and how to protect them from getting in the wrong hands. These children getting in the wrong hands here, or you release them and then maybe they're taken advantage of by those human traffickers or these coyotes who are charging them $3,500 to traffic here. So there's a lot to think through here, but I certainly think there's a large place for the church to play and a Christian community to play in this, because we have homeless people without homes, without jobs, and without a way to care for themselves in our midst. And regardless of your policy considerations on that, and sending them back home, and all of those questions, I do think that the church has a really huge opportunity to spread the gospel and meet people where they're at. Open your homes. Perhaps we could be fostering these kids who are coming over and helping get them instated in schools and starting to acclimate to American life in a healthy, safe environment. I mean, those are all ways that I think Christians could really lean into this and say, let's protect some of the vulnerable in our midst. These are women and children. Now, I don't have the statistics for men who are coming across, but maybe that's a different perspective. Maybe you might call me a softie, but from a conservative perspective. But I think that one of the laws that we want to enforce on the books is the asylum standards. And a lot of these families seem to meet those standards. Well, we are at the end of our hour here, but we're going to continue. At the beginning of the hour, Ben Courson is going to join us by phone. He is across the country from us, so I actually would like to get his perspective a little bit on this issue specifically. We're going to be turning to Albert Mohler. Briefing had a really interesting Guttmacher study that he analyzed about decreasing in Christian church membership throughout America right now, and then looking towards Britain as an indicator of what that will mean for us, because Great Britain's always a little bit ahead of us on the cultural, social, Christian side of things. So we'll be breaking that down. And then a little bit later in the hour, Jonathan Teague will also be joining us. He's with Prestonwood Baptist Church, and I'm sure he'll have a lot of input on ministry and how we can continue to spread the gospel in America that looks like it's becoming less Christian. So stay tuned with us. We'll be back right after this short break.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for Point of View. I've got with me Liberty McArtor around the table. Welcome, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsey. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. We've been wrapping up our discussion about the immigration crisis, the border crisis, whatever kind of crisis you want to call it. It certainly is one. There are 17,000 children being detained by Department of Homeland Security every 10 days. So that number is a very large number when you really break it down. They're thinking 2 to 4 million migrants will occur or come here. And what do we do with that? But we want to turn, instead of a policy discussion, we want to round it out with really a faith-based Christian community perspective. We also have joining us is Ben Courson on the line. He is here joining us from afar. Welcome to the conversation, Ben.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm calling today from Orange County, so I'm glad to be a part of this, guys.
Oh, Orange County. How's the weather there?
Oh, you know what? You can't complain. It's always 75, 80 degrees here. I was just doing a show with TBN yesterday. So I whenever I'm in OC, I'm never complaining.
Well, good. You enjoy that. It is also warm here, so we're grateful for that. But then we've been talking a little bit about the border crisis. I don't know how much you've heard about it. We're in Texas, so we're definitely close to it. And it is a crisis, but we wanted to turn and discuss the opportunity that we have as Christians to respond in this day and age where, you know, the Christian church, we'll talk about a little bit later in this hour, the membership is down, evangelical, the spread of the gospel is down in our country. We're seeing the cultural remnants of that everywhere and the ramifications of that everywhere. But right now, what we have is tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors at the border being held in facilities, and women. And I don't know what the number for men are. They're not really reporting that. And of course, the Biden administration is not allowing media in the detention centers. He has openly acknowledged that and said when things get better, we'll allow media in. So one of the reasons I want to use Point of View to discuss this issue is to bring truth and light to what's really occurring. But the opportunity specifically that we as Christians have to homeless women and children in our midst, many are seeking asylum and fleeing from really devastating circumstances, dangerous circumstances, and are in the legal process of seeking asylum. So, Ben, let's start with you. I know you're not here, but what are you thinking in terms of you're in the ministry? How can we serve? And what would be a great way to really spread the love of Jesus during this time to so many hurting?
Well, I have a sort of twofold response to, first of all, the initial thing you said about the spread of the evangelical gospel really suffering a downturn statistically. I actually, what I heard, and you can either corroborate this or correct this, that Barnum reported that churches are only meeting at like 30% on average around the country or globe or whatever. But basically, it's have you heard that stat that it's at like 30% church attendance as to what it was pre-COVID?
No, I will take your word at it. You can be our church expert.
Okay. Well, I haven't confirmed that, but that's what I've heard down the grapevine. And just even speaking around and talking to different pastors, that seems to be pretty close to on the mark. But the second thing that I would say, and this is super important, is the first character in the Bible to ever name God was an Egyptian immigrant slave girl living in a different culture than what she was inured or accustomed to. So she was a stranger and a foreigner, and her name was Hagar, and she was dying in a desert. She was dying in a wilderness, and she was rescued by God. And in Genesis, she said, "You are El Roy," which literally means the God who sees. And what I think is so fascinating about that is a lot of times God will reveal himself. For example, to Abraham, "I am Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides," or he'll reveal himself as Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. But the first time a Bible character had the chutzpah and audacity to actually nickname God with a moniker and sobriquet was an Egyptian immigrant slave girl. And the reason I think that's so important is we have to remember that's where the mojo is. That's where the juice is. It's in the immigrant. It's in the widow. It's in the refugee. It's in the orphan. It's in the poor, the marginalized, the needy. And this is trans-political. Like, regardless of where somebody might land on the aisle, I just think it's so important that we remember God is a father to the fatherless. He would be named first and foremost by an immigrant refugee who was suffering in a wilderness. So with all of these immigrants who are suffering during this time, we have to remember that God's heart there's a special place. The best way I can put it is there's a special place in God's heart for those people. And so the best that we can do, or the more we manifest that heart of God to those people, the more we're in line with the Evangelion.
Well, Ben, I knew we were going to have you on to preach today, so thank you for bringing it and rising to the occasion. That's such a good perspective, and it's one, I think this can be a really political issue or a really divisive issue, and my goal right now is not to go there even politically, but to say what you're saying, Ben, which is like, this is a human issue, and we have brothers and sisters out there in Christ, or people who do not yet know Christ, coming in droves. And for me, I think it could be a really cool opportunity for churches who are at 30% capacity, as you mentioned, to open their doors. We have huge facilities, huge brick and mortar churches across our state in Texas. We're the Bible Belt. So, Ben, I know you're in California, but here you've got a church on every single corner, and they're not being used. They're largely emptied because of COVID. Just to open our doors and say, hey, let's house them. Oh, by the way, we're going to have Bible study morning, noon, and night. Oh, by the way, here's free Bibles. You know, I think there's a huge way to serve these people and to truly show Christ to people who are maybe fleeing some circumstances that we will never know how truly difficult what they're facing is. Liberty, we have just a minute left before the break, Liberty, but did you want to add what Ben was speaking to?
Yes, and I love that, Ben. Thank you so much for reminding us of that story. It's so powerful. And I would just say, this reminds me a few years ago when I was reporting on a story for the stream.org. I visited a church who was holding a conference on the refugee crisis coming out of the Middle East at the time. And they put the politics aside and said, we need to remember to kind of look through current events through God's eyes sometimes. And he works in mysterious ways, and we can have our policy views, and that's fine. But they were saying because of that crisis that was causing so many refugees to flee the Middle East into European nations, missionaries had an opportunity at that time to reach many people that they had not had access to because of the laws in the countries they were coming from that prevented Christian missionaries. So today we need to also say, how can we look through this from God's eyes? What is God doing? Is he bringing people here for us to witness to, even if it's for a season? And if so, then we need to take advantage of that and really say, how can we spread the gospel in this time?
I think that's a really great point, that it's an international access. I also heard from one of the programs here, like for instance, one of the universities here was doing an English speaking program that, for instance, immigrants from Japan, like less than 1% of the population is Christian in Japan, even though it's been an open country for decades. The gospel just does not spread as easily there. That they would get the chance to essentially make them missionaries for when they go back home. So that's another way to think through that. We're going to head to one of our breaks, but stay tuned. We're going to come back and talk about trends in the church and what we're seeing in some studies that have come out recently.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
There was a time in the past when political leaders of both parties talked about the importance of religion in the founding of this country. Terry Jeffrey found a speech by an urban Northeastern Democrat that illustrated this so well. The candidate proclaimed that a devotion to fundamental religious principles has characterized American thought and action. He argued that the nation's greatest leaders understood the essential religious idea of our founding. Our earliest legislation was inspired by this deep religious sense. Our first leader, Washington, was inspired by this deep religious sense, and Lincoln was inspired by this deep religious sense, he continued. Then his speech turned to a warning. He sensed that the very principles on which the nation was founded were being attacked. He warned that these basic religious ideas are challenged by atheism and materialism, at home in the cynical philosophy of many of our intellectuals, abroad in the doctrine of collectivism, which sets up the twin pillars of atheism and materialism as the official philosophical establishment of the state. Near the end of the speech, he said, "We cannot assume that the struggle is ended. It is never ending. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It was the price yesterday, it is the price today, it will ever be the price." This was a rousing speech about liberty and religious ideals delivered by an urban Northeastern Democrat who also warned that we faced a struggle from secular materialistic enemies here and abroad. How did this candidate do after giving such a speech? Well, he was first elected to Congress and later elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 years later, he was elected President of the United States. His name was John F. Kennedy. His speech back then wasn't that controversial. It was even prophetic. But I doubt it would be permitted in today's Democrat Party. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman, and I'm joined by phone by Ben Courson. He's a senior pastor at Applegate Christian Fellowship and the founder of Hope Generation. I've also got around the table Liberty McArtor. She's a freelance writer with First Liberty Institute and Point of View. So I'm sure you guys actually get to hear her point of view quite often. But we've been really rounding out our discussion on what the church can do during this border crisis that we're seeing, a humanitarian crisis, and we have a lot of empty churches in Texas, and thinking it just would be an ideal opportunity for us as a collective church and community to say, hey, can I raise my hand and foster some kids or house some children and care for what are now, I guess, orphaned children or unaccompanied minors and their mothers who come across. So that's a huge opportunity and one I don't want us to miss as a church, when it would be much better if we were to care for people than it would be the federal government. So we'll leave that there, but we're actually going to turn now to a little bit more about the church. We have an article on pointofview.net if any of our listeners want to go and read about this or any of the other topics we've discussed today. And it's an Albert Mohler briefing for Tuesday. It came out yesterday, and it talked about church membership declining in the United States, and that there's a generational trend of secularization. And what does that tell us? And so I want to turn to this article because it's something that I think we see the issues of all around us. And you look around, it's not hard to see secularization, whether that's through politics. We're saying, how have we gotten here as a country, or how are we so far gone as a country? And I think the answer to that is this. It's that we are less Christian of a nation than we've ever been. And the gospel it's not as discipled or spreading as it once was. And this article discusses those statistics. So, Ben, we'll start with you. When you read this article, did you agree with it? Did you think that that's a trend you've been seeing in the ministry? Can you confirm or conflict with it?
Well, I think we've been undergoing sort of a postmodernist zeitgeist in our culture in Christendom for a really long time. This is kind of a different take on it, but I was actually studying how The Simpsons, and this is all going to tie in, so just bear with me.
Oh, go for it.
The Simpsons are actually, by the way, before I even get into this, it is so good what you're sharing with these empty churches being used to practice pure and undefiled religion, which is to care for orphans, widows, remain unspotted from the world, basically care for people in time of need, which is what we did at our home church when there were 36 wildfires raging through Oregon. Like our governor, Kate Brown, said it was the worst cause of loss of life and property in the state of Oregon's history caused by wildfires. So we have all this gorgeous property, and we said, hey, let's use it to house people and to help people, temporarily during this time. And it's just so gratifying. Like, when Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive, like that's what makes me proud of the people at our church who made that happen, Mm-hmm. So that number one, I want to say that's really good. That should be sort of the mission statement, I think, of the church, is that we are helping as the hands and feet of the Christ dimension, the world around us and those hurting and needy. But secondly, what I want to say about sort of the postmodernist secularization of our culture is this. The Simpsons, there's this argument to be made that The Simpsons is a result of World War I. Because when World War I happened, that's when the Lost Generation emerged. And you have Hemingway and these writers who were journalists covering the war and experiencing the war. And then World War I was the first time where the romanticism of battle and sort of the heroism of the romantic side of warfare, C.S. Lewis called it the gaiety of battle, started to diminish, because now men were being mowed down by machines. And it kind of lost that chivalrous aspect to it. So with the advent of the machine gun and tanks, everything kind of changed. And so ever since then, and we're talking a little over 100 years ago, it's just gotten more and more jaded to where you have Letterman who does late night in the 90s, and it's just very cynical. You know what I mean? Like it's sarcastic, it's sardonic, it's ironic. Well done, but cynical. And The Simpsons, it's very postmodernist, self-referential, wink into the camera, sort of this tautological, meta-recursive, like just referencing the self all the time and not like art not taking itself too seriously. So what's happened is that has seeped into the church. That seeped into Christianity, where now we're seeing the rates of depression have tripled since the coronavirus. But it's not just out there that the cynicism is happening. It's actually seeping into the church. So to tie it all together, pure and undefiled religion is not just to take care of orphans and widows, the needy, which is what we were talking about earlier, but also to remain unspotted from the world, not to be conformed to the world system of thinking, but to be transformed in the spirit of the mind. And so I really do think that is happening, that there's this sort of jaded cynicism that's creeping into the church. And it's something that we really need to fight red in tooth and claw against.
That's been, you are in ministry and you're in the front lines of ministry. And so your perspective, of course, I so appreciate and respect. I always want to ask why, why are we seeing these trends? What do we think that jadedness is coming from? I mean, do you have an answer or a philosophy on where you think that's...
Yeah, well, the sociological data shows us. I'm going to give sort of a sociological data perspective and then also a Navy SEAL perspective. So here we go. Number one is the sociological one. One of the chief reasons is literally because of social media, this sort of jaded depression has been exacerbated in the millennials today. So, I mean, it goes without saying that we're creating this cognitive dissonance, projecting this avatar to the world that isn't even true to what's really happening. Like, and I try to say this even in my sermons, like, I am not as cool as my social media. Like, I'm just not. Like, my life is not, and obviously that's where we network and that's where we make moves. I don't even like the word network, but like, that's where we make moves and we make great connections and some of my best friends through social media. But I think one of the things that's happened is in this TikTok culture with instant gratification as juxtaposed against delayed gratification and satisfaction. We're living in a day where we get results quickly. Jesus was living in an era of seeds, not switches. Post-industrial revolution, we're now getting everything instantly. Like, think how many buttons you press today, counting the touchscreen on your phone, or turning your car on, or turning on the TV, or turning on a light, or turning on a faucet. We get everything instant. But in Jesus's generation, 90-some% of his parables were nature-based. He used the example of seeds, which take time to germinate. They don't bring instant results. So I think we live in a soulical world of switches rather than a spiritual world of seeds. And because of this, we have lost the ability to be patient, which is synonymous with perseverant. And because of that, because we don't know how to persevere, here's the Navy SEAL side. Dan Crenshaw argued, and he's actually, I believe he's in the House now, but basically he argued that our generation has grown soft, that we get everything we want so quickly, that growing up in the lack of luxury, we don't know what to do when hard times come, or how to weather or batten down the hatches or deal with those times. Therefore, we become even more jaded, even more cynical, and even more depressed.
It's funny you're saying that, because I did see an article pop up. I believe it was Forbes, maybe New York Times, but it wasn't a Christian source. It was someone who was saying that they think that the depression and anxiety increase we've had in generations, millennials, starting with millennials and younger, and the Generation Z has had such an increase in statistics and anxiety that it's because of exactly what you're saying. There haven't been as many direct conflicts or challenges to overcome. It's been a little bit cushy as a culture. Liberty, we're going to a break in about a minute, but do you want to add to what Ben is saying?
Sure. And Ben, yeah, I just love your perspective on this. And I love a minute ago when you were going back to the historical perspective, because sometimes we can look in our little bubble of a generation or so and try to understand these big trends that are happening, but we really have to go back further in history. And so this is kind of, a little bit of a unique take, but I think as Christians, we have to consider all factors here. And so, like, after World War I, like you were saying, it was a lost generation. Literature changed as well. And so now we have kind of this trend. You were going through entertainment, and now we have social media, which is a main source of entertainment for a lot of our generation. And I think our moral imagination has really suffered as well. And that's not the only cause, but it's a big one. So I always like to plug books, because you can find a lot of information on how literature and entertainment changed and really kind of encouraged this cynicism and depression after the First World War. So one of my favorite authors, her name is Karen Swallow Prior, and a couple years ago, she wrote on reading well, finding the good life through great books. And she goes through all these great books of history and how they correlate with certain biblical virtues. So if you want your kid to be well read and develop a moral imagination that combats this cynicism, I would definitely recommend that book.
Okay, I'm going to write that down, because I have 3 boys I have to turn into men, and it's daunting. So be praying for us over here. But when we get back, Jonathan Teague is joining us. We're going to continue this discussion about decline in church membership and belief, but also what do we do as a society and as a Christian culture to not stand aside and to actually engage in that.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable. And if you want to read about the articles we've discussed today or any of the topics we're discussing, don't forget to go to pointofview.net. You can also watch live on Point of View Radio on Facebook, see our faces, comment, leave questions. You can call the line at 800-351-1212. We would love to hear your perspective and opinions as we break down the world around us from our millennial perspectives. We're doing our best here, but around the table, we've got Liberty McArtor. She's a freelance writer, so thanks for being with us, Liberty.
Thanks, Chelsey. It's great to be here.
Yes, I love having Liberty here because the other two are going to be on the phone. So you'll hear from Ben Courson, who is joining us all the way from the sunny state of California. Thanks for joining, Ben.
Thanks, Chelsey. Thanks, Liberty. Thanks for having me.
You got it. And then now joining us is Jonathan Teague. He's the minister to married adults with Prestonwood Baptist Church. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Well, hey guys, it is so good to be with you. And yes, I'm bummed I can't be in the studio. I think I'm going to be with you guys live next month, but it's always good to hang out and talk. Look forward to the conversation.
It's always good. Well, just for anyone joining us now, we have been discussing Albert Mohler really did a great breakdown, I thought, from a Christian perspective of the Guttmacher study that came out recently that said church membership is on the decline. And this does not, I don't think this surprises anyone. We can look around us and see the ramifications of a culture that does not believe in Christ. And I mean, there's so much around us, but only 47% of Americans responded to the survey said that they have formal church membership. And that is a decrease from 70% in the 1930s. And he kind of went through the generational gaps here. And at every generation, that decrease is greater and greater. So the amount of people who are formally members at churches and attending churches decreases with each generation. The difference, and you might be thinking this because I think I originally thought this, I heard this growing up at least anecdotally, was, well, when the younger generation, they'll be raised in church and then they'll spend a few years not going to church as much and kind of fall away from the faith. But once they have families and children, they inevitably come back to their roots and they reaffiliate with the faith that they were raised with. And this study actually showed that that's no longer the case. And I want to highlight that because it is a vast departure from the generations before us that we specifically as millennials are not returning to the faith when we have families and children. And to me, that's really sad. It's really devastating. And Ben did a great job kind of discussing historically how he thinks we've got there, the rise of cynicism, immediate, affirmation and the development of technology and everything. But Liberty, on the break, you and I were discussing too, what I thought is, people take for granted that our generation, we were the first generation raised where the major institutions of society were failing and there were cracks in that. The institution of the family unit, for instance, we are the first generation where more of us had divorced parents than those that parents stuck together. Over 50% of our parents divorced. And Liberty, will you add to that? Because I want to say that I think the erosion of things in society that kept society together and stabilized have really changed in the last few decades. And I think that that's a really huge contribution of cynicism and a lack of faith or trust maybe in institutions in general. Our generation's very, very distrusting of government, of businesses. We get married more reluctantly, probably because of some of that. What are your thoughts?
Definitely. I mean, you can look at statistics to see that trust in institutions, like you mentioned, is falling dramatically. And, it even goes down to, I think, just the communities that we were raised in. We live in a very mobile society now, which is great, but we don't have roots that are as strong as prior generations, and church membership is a part of that. But, so is the family. And so the family breaks up and you have less opportunities in the small town. So a lot of times our generation, we moved away from where we were raised and went to college somewhere and kind of settled in bigger cities. But along with that, you kind of have this lack of any sense of rootedness or of, accountability of the people that you were raised with, and that, the honorary family that so often comes with the local communities if you're raised in that. And so there's all these contributing factors. And then we have the rise of social media, which our generation really kind of grew up halfway with, I would say.
Right.
And then, how that contributes to loneliness, and then not having a church community contributes to loneliness and depression, and then broken families, and it really all correlates, but you can't ignore any of these factors.
They definitely play a role. Jonathan, you're just now joining this, and I would love to get your input, because you do, again, serve at a large church that's really dedicated to spreading the gospel and Christian values. So what are you seeing there on the front lines?
Yeah, I love this topic, Chelsey. And I really appreciate you pulling from Dr. Muller's insights. I love that you're pulling from Dr. Muller's insights here, because I think he's a thought leader, certainly for Southern Baptists and more broadly for evangelicals now. And I love it when more seasoned leaders, and we'll use the word older, not to be unkind, but just to be accurate, speak down into generations and the different issues that they see. So I love older leaders that are engaged with younger people. That's a big deal. This is actually the thrust of my doctoral work that I did at Southern Seminary the last 5 years. And we talked particularly about what are the root causes of millennial drift, if you will, out of not only the church, but religion in general. And he speaks a lot to the rise of the nun, and James Miller White's book talks a lot about that. But I think to Liberty's point, and I'm sure Ben, I know, would have great thoughts on this as well. And I think it does really boil down into the erosion of cultural institutions that for not hundreds of years, and not just in America, but thousands of years around the world, were normative, right? So marriage, generally speaking, the operation of government and culture, and certainly the role of the local church and religion at large, so that it was a default for people in older generations, particularly the silent generation, baby boomers that fought World War II and beyond. But something happened in the 1950s and 70s in particular, where you saw a dramatic societal and cultural shift in the understanding of truth and what the core tenets of morality looked like. Mm-hmm. And the kids of those generations, that's us, that's millennials, were thrust into a world where overnight technology revolutionized the world, not regions, but the world. Social media, I mean, one sociologist is saying you can put social media in the category, this is kind of a stretch, in the category of wheel and the printing press, because of how proliferate its impact has been. I don't know if we should give Facebook that much credit, but it's definitely changed the way we communicate. I saw, I think, from Pew Research today that said now in America and Western Europe, 70% of adults and close to 90% of young adults don't trust the government anymore. And so somebody just said a moment ago and hit it dead on, the cynicism and the mistrust of institutions play a huge part in this. Millennials are getting married later. They're having kids later. The average American woman now is being married at 29.7 years. Her first baby is being born around 30. That decade of your 20s is formative. Mm-hmm. And with singleness on the rise, marriage going down, I think you see millennials carving out a new normal for how they do life and family. And that has absolutely intersected into their spiritual life. So candidly, I don't see it as a problem. I see it as an opportunity. It's an issue for sure. But I think we need to understand what the factors are that got us where we are. Because I actually think people like Dr. Moeller, my pastor, other seasoned leaders, that's the key. And in local churches, it's older people, actually mature believers, that actually I think are the key to really rescuing the hearts of young adults. So I don't really get excited about generational differences in the church. I like to talk about generational commonalities as we think about helping younger people stay engaged in their faith longer.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ben, I know that you were speaking earlier to a little bit about that. Will you piggyback off Jonathan and discuss, what you're in a different area too than the Bible Belt?
Yeah, Jonathan, great word. So here's the thing. I have a unique position in that I travel all the time. So a big part of my work is doing book tours. And it's weird because I read the stats and it's like, man, the church is declining. But then in my personal subjective experience, I see a lot of Christianity booming too, So it's weird when you sort of see that dissonance and disconnect, because you read the stats and you're like, wow, is like Christianity dying? And then I'm out in the front lines and I'm like, it seems to be doing pretty good, like where I'm going, I guess. That's just my perspective on it. G.K. Chesterton, one of my favorite Catholic writers, said that whenever Christianity seems to go to the dogs, it's the dogs that die. And you look at like how that happened with you mentioned the printing press. In the Reformation, it seems like every 500 years there's some major like breakthrough in technology or culture. So you would not have had Martin Luther and his movement being nearly what it was. I don't even know if you'd have Martin Luther without Gutenberg's printing press, because the Reformation was in concert with Gutenberg's printing press. Again, you don't have Paul the Apostle without the Roman roads. So the Roman Empire and the Hellenization through Greek culture of Alexander the Great, conquering most of the known world for the brotherhood of mankind, speaking a common language.
Great
All
points,
of this stuff
Ben.
is
When we
super
get
important.
back after the break, we'll continue to hear from Ben Courson on his role with technology and the spread of the gospel.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host for the Millennial Roundtable. And we just heard from Ben Courson on the line, and he's discussing that he's still seeing a robust, faithful following in the Christian church, in spite of what we have posted on pointofview.net, the article that discusses a decrease in membership overall. And Liberty, you had something over the break I really want you to add to that, kind of a good thought to include.
Sure, which I really appreciate Ben's perspective, because I know he's on the front lines doing, all the work with ministry. But one thing I think we can think about as we balance optimism and hope with kind of the reality of the situation is, if we're super engaged in church and ministry and we're seeing other people, our core community around us being engaged, what we have to think about is, we can celebrate the people who are there, but then who's not there that should be, and who are the people that, are absent, and we're not seeing them because they're absent, and how can we reach them? And I think those are probably where a lot of the numbers are coming from that we're seeing, on the decline in church membership in in the United States. So.
You know, I love that you're saying that, Liberty, because we're thinking through, if you look forward in the article, they discuss Great Britain, and that they're just describing Great Britain as post-religion or post-Christian. And so it's not that this is like pre-spread of the gospel trend. And we always do in our line of work, whether that was the religious liberty movement or the abortion movement, we always look towards Europe as what's coming down the pipeline, because culturally they're a step ahead of us. They saw the same decline in church membership that we're seeing now decades ago. And so now they're officially calling their culture post-Christian, which is the gospel was not here in the medieval era. It was largely secularized. It spread robustly. And then now it's dwindled and they're post-Christian. And he discussed typically what we see is generational spread of faith. And so we spread faith onto our children and their children. And now they're trending in Great Britain to have a secularization spread. And so you're trending from being not a robust atheist or someone who strongly adheres to atheism, but secularism, and saying, oh, I don't really affiliate with the faith. And then your children don't really affiliate with the faith. And I think that's a really apt point, because I always look at things like this and think, well, what can we do? How can I translate this into action? Because I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, so I'm action oriented. But one of the issues is biblical illiteracy. And the other is something I wrote an amicus brief to the Supreme Court years ago when there was a case coming down against Christian schools. And I brought in a study from both the Orthodox Jewish faith, so specifically Hasidic Jews, who it is a tenet of their faith that their children attend Hasidic schools to perpetuate their faith. And then the Seventh-day Adventists, where it's also a tenet of their faith that their children must attend Seventh-day Adventist schools. And that is because there's a 90% faithfulness rate among children who are educated in their faith. And so I don't want to open the door too broadly here to like a homeschooling coalition issue, but to say, as I have 3 young children under 4 and I'm looking at them and seeing how their minds work, is the secularization part of that go part and parcel with the secular education they're receiving? And as parents, if we're looking to rectify these trends and really make sure our faith is perpetuated, it has to come through discipleship. So Ben, we'll start back with you. I'd love to get your thoughts on the education component and where do we go from here in ministry?
Well, it's interesting because, and I'm going to kind of throw a grenade into the conversation, but I tend to be predisposed to sort of anti-establishment personality by nature, in that I love skateboarding. You know, I think institutions can quickly grow corrupt, in that, you know, the establishment is always bent on its own self-preservation. And I think a great argument could be made that the early sect of the Nazarene and the Way was an anti-establishment movement. That being said, I was just studying Hegel the other day, the philosopher from a few hundred years ago, and he talked about how institutions are actually needed in order to further and advance ideas. And the truth is, I head up a couple institutions, so it's kind of hypocritical in that sense on one hand. Here's what I'm saying. I think when it comes to education, something I'm very passionate about, even in Christian education, is if we want to go back to like the founder of scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, one of the things he was really good at doing, he said, there's never been a line from a book that I have read that I did not understand. And he was responsible for, you know, reconciling Aristotle to Christ. Something that I'm really passionate about is we need to encourage young people to, in literature, follow their curiosity. Because the more we're told, like, oh, English literature, for example, is taboo because we're going to follow Europe, I think that we're going to kind of go into the dark ages that way. What I found is that there is a way through scholasticism, through the Thomas Aquinas method, to actually use metaphysics, epistemology, value theory, ethics, aesthetics, using these things to as we follow our curiosity, to actually explore the great knowledge of God. So that's kind of how I would look at it.
Well, Jonathan, you're in the ministry, and I know that you've got some answers for us because you're in the ministry. So you have to have answers for us. Tell us, where do we go from here? So. Declining church membership. What are your initial thoughts on how to help correct the ship or right the ship or disciple through this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love, you know, I think Ben and Liberty and I both all would kind of view this from perhaps different angles of the prism, but with the same conclusions. At the end of the day, one of the things that I think millennials and Generation Z for sure are going to show us is their absolute tenacious desire to own whatever it is they believe. Mm-hmm. And I love that aspect of the younger generations in America right now, which, by the way, number in the range of somewhere around 150 million people. When it's all said and done, the millennials, depending on when you count the bookends, generationally, is going to be about 80 million people. Gen Z may be something like 85 million. They're wildly multi-ethnic, multicultural, global. Diversity is baked into the ethos of how they think. Okay, so when we think about how are we going to wrestle to the ground this issue of church membership in particular, which is really all about identifying with a local body and commitment is really what I think Dr. Muller and others are driving at there. I think that what we have to understand, Chelsey, is at the essence of all of this, we're not dealing with people. I choose not to believe. This is just my personal conviction. Like how Ben said, in just conversations and speaking to other churches and teaching and being in ministry for 20 years, being a former youth pastor, this is just where I've landed. I refuse to become a cynic or skeptic that God can't work in this younger generation. I'm just not going to do that.
Yes.
In particular, because if you look at the history of revivals, it's always younger people, number one. Number two, there is a season in your life, and the Apostle Paul kind of alludes to this in 1 Corinthians. There's a season in your life, too, where in particular, your ability to just kind of go for Jesus is right in that sweet spot of your college years and maybe even early 20s. And now, for the average American man and woman, most of their 20s. And so I think that needs to be a time of redemptive gospel growth. It means the church has got to get more creative. We've got to get more engaging. I don't think that we've sacrificed generational appeasement. That's not what I mean there at all. But I think that it does mean that we have to be willing to say, first and foremost, we're not giving up on younger people. And that secondly, that what Romans 1 says is still true, right? Which is at the end of the day, there's a soul longing inside everyone to understand their relationship to their Creator. And I think that if we'll stay pressed into that, I think we put ourselves in a position to have a chance. And I think it starts in conversations in the education system. I think that it starts in conversations within local churches as well.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think we're speaking similarly in that it's going to require the big C church, that's church members, people who are advocates in their faith, to disciple someone younger than them, educate their children in the faith, and continue to say, hey, am I perpetuating our gospel on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, which requires us to have biblical literacy and be in the words ourselves. So such truth from Ben. Thank you for joining us, Ben. We are going to turn here to a break. When we get back, it's time to turn to COVID, because what else is there going on in the world? Just kidding. There's lots going on, but we've got mask mandates. The World Health Organization came down with something that we're going to discuss. So stay tuned or go to pointofview.net and read about these articles or more.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome to the Millennial Roundtable on Point of View today. I'm your host, Chelsey Youman, and I am here to help navigate all kinds of things we're talking about. We've been talking about a little bit about the border crisis, what I'll call a church crisis, a decline in church membership, how we as Christians should respond to these things in the world around us from a cultural and Christian perspective. With me today on the line, I have Jonathan Teague. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Great to be here, Chelsey.
And also around the table, I've got Liberty McArtor. She's a freelance writer, so she has lots of good creative ideas. I love her fresh perspective. Thanks for joining us, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsey. It's great to be here.
Yes, well, it's been fun. We've unpacked quite a few things. I'm just going to keep us on the controversy train because I was telling Liberty on the break, I'm a little bit fired up about COVID, which I think we all kind of have our moments. But it's been a full year. We're ending March, so we have been in various forms of lockdown across the country. Life as we know it is still different, looks different, feels different, is stagnant. The economy is suffering. Our education is suffering. Our churches are suffering. I mean, you name the arena, we have seen an impact because of COVID. And so I want to talk about what an article we have on our website. You can go to pointofview.net to read about this or more of the things we've talked about today. But President Biden recently this week called on states to keep mask mandates, which surprises no one. He has been adamantly opposed to states like Texas, Mississippi. I want to say it was Michigan, a different state, lifted their COVID mask mandate bans. And he had the CDC join him in this press conference, who said, we have seen an uptick in the last few months. COVID cases peaked around 300,000 in January. And then they declined very, very drastically. But now they're back up to about 67,000. So still a third of the peak. But she said, we don't have the luxury of inaction, and said, I'm going to lose my script today. I'm in reflect on the reoccurring feelings I have of impending doom. We have so much to look forward to in promise and potential where we are, and so much reason for hope. But right now I'm scared. And she said that in the White House Monday briefing. So I want to talk about this. I'll start with, we got to start with facts. I think everything, we're entitled to our own opinions on the show, but we're not entitled to our own facts. So I'm going to bring some facts forward. One of those being that, yes, there is, as I mentioned, an uptick. There was a spike in cases by 133% in the last few weeks, but still has not reached the nationwide peak that we saw back in January. Yes, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, rescinded the Texas mask mandate a little over 2 weeks ago. But in those 2 weeks, Texas has actually seen a decline in cases of 17%. Meanwhile, Michigan, I think I said Michigan earlier, also rescinded parts of its statewide mask mandate, but it saw an increase in cases in 103%. And so what the National Review is arguing is that there's not actually no correlation whatsoever right now, or no real resounding evidence that a mask has a bearing on the coronavirus cases. And of course, we have to say that 98 million people officially have their vaccine. So almost a third of Americans are vaccinated. That doesn't include the amount of people who've already had it, such as myself, who have our antibodies. And so we're quickly seeing what we're hoping is going to be a point where there's a herd immunity or a type of immunity forming from both the vaccines, antibodies. So what do we make of these facts? For me, there was an evidence in a large study that came out of Sweden that showed that masks in Sweden had zero bearing on the coronavirus rate. So for me, I want to back up. I think we've heard about the mask debate, so you guys can speak to that if you, Jonathan and Liberty, want to. But what I would like to talk about, I think, is like the conditioning of the human mindset in the last year. That's the big picture red flag for me, where I heard a sitting U.S. president say, if you play your cards right and you do exactly what Big Daddy government tells you, you might be able to have a small barbecue on Independence Day. And that really didn't resonate well with me. I mean, if we're looking at the facts, and we're looking at CDC guidelines, and we're saying masks don't necessarily correlate one way or another to the spread of the virus, perhaps vaccines have something to do with that. But for us to have a sitting president feel comfortable telling the American people what they can and can't, they can have a small gathering of 8, maybe 6 months from now. That was very disconcerting for me. So I know I've unpacked a lot here. We're going to start with you, Jonathan. What would you like to add or debate me on based on what I've said?
Well, I mean, it's golly. And here we thought 2021 was going to be way better, right? You know, it's so funny because I hear your point, Chelsey. It's interesting. But so like going back to our generational discussion, 80 years ago when Franklin Roosevelt told people to black out their city over fear of Nazi and Japanese bombers, people gladly complied, right? When the New Deal kicked in and various programs. I think this will come up again when we talk later about the infrastructure bill coming up, to rescue people out of significant real poverty. Most people didn't push back. Some did, but a lot didn't. And so Americans have, by and large, been early adopters for certain things. We built bomb shelters in our elementary schools in the 50s and 60s. And we absolutely condemned communism in the earliest days of the Cold War, almost unilaterally as a nation. So here's what's interesting, right, is now I read this the other day, maybe the Wall Street Journal, talking about how the absolute divide that has opened up inside of many people's minds as it relates to when the government tells us something and or when entities like the CDC tell us something, it's almost impossible for people to not politicize those narratives anymore. And therefore, we are far less trusting of what they tell us to do. And it's an unfortunate and really even sad reality for us now in the country because we really, in a lot of ways, we don't know who to trust, and we are reticent to apply what people in authority say, depending on who's in power and where we find ourselves on the political spectrum. And so what ends up happening is you go state to state, which is what President Trump was more or less doing. And now what President Biden doing is on the opposite end of the spectrum, saying, nope, I need you guys to comply. And maybe he's coming with a federal mandate soon. I don't know. So, I mean, regardless of what I think about masks or any of those things, it's just, I think it's important that we see the highlighted just chasm of differences and the cynicism that's baked in for a lot of people on how they look at what the government's telling them to do. And it's really unfortunate because we can't get energy to get over these things.
Well, in one hand, I definitely see your points. And of course, I would say, like, as a Christian, my first question is, how can I serve my community well? And so even though I have antibodies, I still wear a mask everywhere I go for others' comfort. Not even because of fear or worrying about spreading, but I don't want other people to look at me and be nervous, right? And so, there's that consideration for your neighbor, and we're going to go to a break soon, but I'll push back, Jonathan, and I'll say our whole world looks different. I mean, the whole world was willing to shut down and did. We shut schools down. We shut jobs down. The economy is shut down. Businesses are permanent. I mean, depression rates are on the high. In spite of record suicide, I mean, we have seen terrible devastation in our communities in the last year unrelated to COVID that we willingly succumbed to in an effort to abide by what people were saying. And what my point is if at some point stats are coming out that masks aren't making a difference, or some states are reopening and allowing people to flourish again and they're safe, we have a duty to look at it. It's not March 2020 anymore. Stick with us. I think there's more debate to come.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
There was a time in the past when political leaders of both parties talked about the importance of religion in the founding of this country. Terry Jeffrey found a speech by an urban Northeastern Democrat that illustrated this so well. The candidate proclaimed that a devotion to fundamental religious principles has characterized American thought and action. He argued that the nation's greatest leaders understood the essential religious idea of our founding. Our earliest legislation was inspired by this deep religious sense. Our first leader, Washington, was inspired by this deep religious sense, and Lincoln was inspired by this deep religious sense, he continued. Then his speech turned to a warning. He sensed that the very principles on which the nation was founded were being attacked. He warned that these basic religious ideas are challenged by atheism and materialism, at home in the cynical philosophy of many of our intellectuals, abroad in the doctrine of collectivism, which sets up the twin pillars of atheism and materialism as the official philosophical establishment of the state. Near the end of the speech, he said, "We cannot assume that the struggle is ended. It is never ending. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. It was the price yesterday, it is the price today, it will ever be the price." This was a rousing speech about liberty and religious ideals delivered by an urban Northeastern Democrat who also warned that we faced a struggle from secular materialistic enemies here and abroad. How did this candidate do after giving such a speech? Well, he was first elected to Congress and later elected to the U.S. Senate. 14 years later, he was elected President of the United States. His name was John F. Kennedy. His speech back then wasn't that controversial. It was even prophetic. But I doubt it would be permitted in today's Democrat Party. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsey Youman, and before we get back to our topic, which we're I think having a robust discussion, to say the least, about COVID and 1 year later where we are as a society. Do we continue on with the March 2020 plan? Do we pivot? We'll get there. But before I go there, please go to pointofview.net. Right now, on our very front page, scroll down just a little bit, you can actually talk to your senators directly and advocate against the Equality Act, which I would strongly recommend you do. Please, right now, www.pointofview.net, go down and click Contact Your Senators about the Equality Act. It's a devastating piece of legislation, and it is moving, by the way, at the federal level. They have the votes they need to pass it and do a lot of damage on everything from traditional views on gender and equality to abortion even, and funding abortion as now a part of gender equality and access, including insurance-funded abortion. So whether you care about any of those issues or one of those issues, it's going to really have a damaging impact on society. So please contact your senator, be active, be an advocate, go to pointofview.net. But now we're going to turn to something a little bit less political, at least I hope. And we're saying, look, we know that President Biden is still sounding the gong about wearing your masks and mask mandates, which for a lot of us as Christians, a lot of us have said, look, that's a small thing. That's a small thing we can do as a society to help our brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. We're looking at some facts that have come out of a study in Sweden. And now we're looking at state to state, states lifting the mandates, and that there's not a lot of corroborating evidence to say that masks actually make a difference. So if you're looking at the facts, we've got CDC giving guidelines. We want to trust CDC. We want to trust, but things are politicized, which was Jonathan's point. Should this be something that's so politicized? Should we even be distrusting? I'm making a little bit of a broader point, which is more about the conditioning of the human mind in America in the last year. And I think that's what I'm concerned about, is that we've been conditioned. If you think differently, if doctors have been blacklisted, John Hopkins lectures have been taken offline and blackballed by YouTube, when perfectly equal medical minds diverge on the issue of the coronavirus, there is censorship happening. And I'm just concerned that, yes, we're always looking at information. Yes, we're pivoting and saying, okay, now almost a third of Americans are vaccinated. People plus that have antibodies. And for me saying, should we still be in the March 2020 mindset? Should we still be conditioned to be so suppressed as a society? Or is there a point where we're willing to say, hey, I think I'm reading the tea leaves and it's time to come out a little bit. It's time to say, like, I can self-govern. I can read my facts and my studies and make some decisions for my family based on our age groups, our ethnicity, and our own health. Liberty, those are the dynamics. I probably said that like a little bit one-sided, so feel free to correct the record, and I'd love to hear your perspective.
No, I think you raise a lot of great points, and I will just start out by saying, let me say this. I think when you talk about conditioning, I will say that I think a lot of people in our nation have been conditioned to fear. And now let me qualify that by saying, when this pandemic started, I was very conscientious, and I would say I still am, about, when Texas issued a stay-at-home order, I complied, and I didn't want to expose myself. I had a toddler at the time. I still have a toddler, but a younger toddler. I didn't want to unnecessarily expose us to something, or expose a loved one to something that was dangerous. I willingly, wore my mask when I was in public. There were things that I didn't do, even if I had friends and family that disagreed with me, because I felt like that was the health conscious thing to do. And I pushed back against people who said, oh, you're living in fear, because at that point I was saying, from my perspective, I am following the facts, and I'm just
and we don't know enough yet. And,
right.
Yeah.
So I would rather err on the side of caution. That doesn't mean I'm living in fear. I don't live in fear when I put my seatbelt on in the car, So I am not saying, if you wear your mask or you social distance, you're living in fear. That is not what I'm saying. But then just this quote from, I think it was the Hill article that you posted on pointofview.net, where Biden and the administration is calling on states to reinstate a mask mandate. And you had the director of the CDC saying that I feel a sense of impending doom. To me, that's where I kind of say, well, that makes me not want to trust institutions, because yes, there is a spike happening. Let's talk about those numbers. Let's talk about the facts, like you said, Chelsey. But when you have somebody who's leading, an American institution like that, saying, well, I feel this sense of impending doom, and that, to me, that kind of speaks to this situation where it's like we're trying to control people by fear now. Not saying, hey, take smart steps to protect your health, but we are seeing a decline in a lot of areas in COVID cases, like in Texas. And I'll brag on Texas a little bit because I'm a proud Texan, but it was a couple weeks ago that the mask mandate in Texas ended. And businesses were allowed to open up to full capacity. And since then, just yesterday, Governor Abbott tweeted out that the 7-day COVID positivity rate continues to stay around 5%. Hospitalizations are at 6-month lows. Now, every person in the state of Texas who wants to receive a COVID vaccine has access to one. And what he said when he lifted all those restrictions was Texans know enough now to make their own decisions to protect their own health. We know how to be safe. We don't need the government telling us exactly what to do to be safe. And that's what I think, we need more of in America, is not trying to continue controlling people with fear, even if the facts say that they can start doing more. We still need to be careful. But, there is a balance of saying, let's look at the facts, let's make smart decisions. But I think we really are getting to a point now where we're being conditioned to fear, and that's kind of where I see us at.
I think that is so well said, Liberty. I'm really grateful you spoke about that in the way you did, because it goes to show that like very reasonable minds can look at the same set of facts and disagree and reach different conclusions. And that for me is what a diverse, free society is about. And we should be allowed, you and me and President Biden and whomever out there, to look at the same set of facts and say, I'm going to land on this side of the equation. And I think that this is what's best for my family. And that's the whole root of the ability to self-govern. And I think, you know, as you're mentioning, like my concern is how many like very intelligent, well-meaning people I know like religiously just follow whatever the government's telling them to do. And if that's what makes them comfortable, great. But when the government, the sitting president says, if you do exactly what I say, you might be able to have family barbecue. I don't know why that really struck such a chord with me in a time where I've tried to play nice and try to follow the rules and do what everyone around me wants us to do for this issue. You know, to hear that, I just realized something that a former colleague of mine once told me. And he said, I think most people assume that communist countries or socialist countries became that way over a set of years and decades. But typically it's one election cycle. And that's been in the back of my mind. Not that we're there, but we certainly are trending towards what I would say is like less freedom and more big government. And we're going to be talking about bigger government even out of the administration and some of the plans they have for what they're calling infrastructure plans in the next segment. But for now, I think it's something we just need to keep our eye on and continue to say, reasonable minds can disagree in a society where if you disagree, you're considered unreasonable. And I don't want that to be the case. So on the show, we're going to talk about the diverging views and continue to talk about what families need to do. And then if you're in a state that you've seen the mandates be really successful, call us and tell us about that. Or if you've seen a difference in society around you in terms of conditioning, I'd be really curious to see what's happening across the country. So call us at 800-351-1212. 800-351-1212. You can also watch us live on Point of View Radio on Facebook. You can click, like, comment, dislike if you must, but we'll take some comments and questions there. You can follow me. I'm the Texas State Director at Human Coalition Action, so feel free to go to humancoalitionaction.org. We do pro-life advocacy and work at the state level, and of course at the federal level where it's very actively pro-abortion right now. So we're advocating there. You can learn more about our mission. And then Liberty McArtor, where can our listeners follow you?
You can go to libertymccartor.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter there. I'm active sometimes, and then sometimes I take a social media break. So you may see me tweeting, you may not, but you can find more of my writing at libertymccartor.com.
Wonderful. And also, when we get back, we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, the Biden administration's infrastructure plan. I think it started out as like a $3 trillion spend, and now they're looking at a $5 trillion spend. How are they going to pay for that after such an aggressive stimulus package? Those are all the questions we'll be looking into. What's baked into the cake for an infrastructure plan? And what you can expect to see, I think, out of the administration as they grapple with the world that we're living in right now. So stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today for our last hour of Point of View. With me around the table, I have Liberty McArtor. Thanks for joining us, Liberty.
Thanks for having me, Chelsey. I've really enjoyed our conversations today.
It's been good. We've got like different perspectives going on, a little bit of loving debate. We've talked about everything from the mask mandate at the Biden administration still being encouraged to what I was calling conditioning humans to continue in that crisis. We talked about the border crisis, abortion bills in Texas. So please go back and listen to the other hours. We've had a really diverse discussion here. You can go to pointofview.net to see those articles. You can also go to pointofview.net, incidentally, to advocate against the Equality Act. Please go to pointofview.net. You can contact your senators by clicking contact your senators about the Equality Act. If you have not been paying attention to the news, and you wouldn't know, but the Equality Act is something that is extremely detrimental to our country. It allows for government-funded abortions, mandated abortion provided by insurance companies. I mean, I think a lot of people are thinking about the Equality Act through the lens of the LGBT issue, but it actually has a profound influence on spreading abortion in our country. And then on the LGBT issue, it also would allow men to participate in women's sports. There's no religious exemptions, by the way, from any of this. So your pastors would have to pay for insurance, for example, that pays for abortions for people who work at your church, or religious schools would have no exemption regarding their traditional biblical views on marriage. There would be no quarter for any religious views on those issues. So it's a really devastating act. I would love for you to advocate against it by contacting your senators at pointofview.net. But before we continue, one more introduction. Jonathan Teague, who is the Minister to Married Adults, is on the line with us. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hey, Chelsey. Good to be back with you.
Yes. Well, we are turning now to talk about President Biden's new, I don't know how new it is, but it's a big infrastructure plan. I'm going to unpack a little bit about what's in it because I'm going to be I don't want to be too vague, but it's a lot to unpack here, and it's a pretty large plan. I think it originally was meant to be $3 trillion, and now we're looking at more like a $5 trillion spend, which is a significant uptake. And originally they were talking about taxing the American people, of course, to pay for what the government's going to be spending. They were talking about they're calling it a rich man tax. So taxing people over a certain pay bracket and then taxing mid and large companies at higher rates. So I'm going to be objective right now, and then we'll get into the opinions. But right now, They're looking to spend at least $2.25 trillion on jobs and infrastructure, and that will include about $650 billion for things like roads, bridges, highways, ports, $400 billion for home care for the elderly and disabled, $300 billion for housing infrastructure, and $300 billion to revive U.S. manufacturing, and then hundreds of billions to work on the electric grid, which I'm sure will include clean energy, because they're also calling this a clean energy project. It should be revamping all of our nation's energy, water systems, clean drinking water, you name it. There's a lot in here. It's going to be what I've been calling a pork barreling nightmare. So we'll see. They'll see where they land on all of this. Off the cuff, I'm going to say a few high level things, and then we'll break it down with everybody here. But one initial thought I had is our economy is still crippled, so I don't want to just completely bifurcate this from the whole picture here. We are in a joblessness crisis. Unemployment is still a major problem. Most small companies and mid-sized companies, there have been closures in historic numbers because of COVID over the last year, and statewide mandates that they not operate at capacity or not have in-person operations. So we have seen really devastation to almost every class of citizen, between lower, middle, or upper, you name it. There's been problems, slow spending, joblessness. So for me, when I'm looking at multi-trillion-dollar bailouts or stimulus packages that were just passed, my initial thought is everybody wants their check, but who's going to be paying for this in taxpayer dollars? So I think that a lot of these policies, regardless of which party has, this started under President Trump, so this is not a partisan comment, but our middle class has been crippled. The lower classes have been crippled, period. And so we need to be thinking from an economic standpoint, what's going to stimulate those. And for me, the answer as a conservative would never be government. Like, the government should not be the big spender, because then we're now all the classes are then going to have to be reliant on stimulus packages and government bailouts, and now infrastructure spending from the government. And so for me, free market is always the answer. I've unpacked a lot here, so I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. Would you like to add on to what I've said, or contradict something I've said?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's super cool that we're just going to blow about $7 trillion this year alone on
Super
stuff.
cool. What a millennial.
It's great. Our children will forever be bound to an endless cycle of black hole government spending. So that's a cheery analysis on my part, I know. Yeah, I mean, again, I think, I referenced this earlier, Chelsey, I think this is a nod, and within the Democratic Party in particular, this is traditional Democratic, now what we can call progressive thinking. And the idea kind of harkens back to a 1930s, 1960s kind of policy base, which is essentially that in order for things to move forward, the government is the catalytic engine for that, particularly government spending from a certain philosophical view. And there have been pockets and windows of history where that's permissible. It wasn't the worst idea, but it's usually not the best idea. And I think that this is something obviously Joe Biden campaigned on. He talked about it in November, or actually in late October. Bernie Sanders did a quick interview where he predicted and said in the first 100 days, we will absolutely do this. So they're keeping their promise, particularly to the base, if you will, of those who elected Joe Biden. I think that, again, you pointed out very wisely, there are agendas packed within this and underneath it. So if you're trying to get a coalition of far left progressives inside the Democratic Party fired up, you probably want to get your arms around the electric grid pretty quickly. The problem is, as we learned in the ice storm in Texas a few weeks ago, a lot of that's been privatized. It's not necessarily government run. So you're going to have to jump that hurdle first of how do you federalize. The last time we did an infrastructure project like this on this scale was in the 50s with Dwight Eisenhower. We were building interstate highways, but there were specific reasons why, and it wasn't into perpetuity. So this is concerning because it just feels like once we reopen the bank, if you will, and I saw where the top end corporate tax is going to have to go up, I think, now to 29%. That means jobs out the window. That's inevitably what that will mean, is corporations will lay people off. So this just has all the makings of a massive federal works program. And I would just bet you 6 months from now, it's going to be challenged in the Supreme Court, aspects of it, at least for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's important. You mentioned that this is going to be $7 trillion spend. They're looking at even $10 trillion over the next decade. Mm-hmm. I mean, what you're alluding to is that this is just a revolutionary overhaul of our grid, of the system as we know it. And of course, clean energy is a part of that. This can't be siphoned off from the global clean energy plans that they have, which will entirely change our economy. It's a really vast thing they're doing, Liberty.
It is. And, this is not my area of expertise, but I can say, to Jonathan's point, before, this is something that generations of Americans will be paying for, and generations of Americans are already paying for other things. One thing that concerns me as, just an American and a millennial is our national debt, and how, I'm not living in a hole thinking that we can get away with never spending anything. I know that government spending is necessary. And like Jonathan said, there are certain situations and certain times in history where, we do need a little bit more government spending for whatever reason. But it needs to be wise, and it needs to be purposeful, and it needs to, be towards something that's really helpful. Otherwise, we're just going to increase our national debt, and that is really going to have tangible, harmful ramifications on future generations of Americans. And so an example of maybe something that is not necessary spending would be on some of these changes in here that they're attributing to climate change, saying we need to spend more to address this crisis. And again, I would just encourage anybody to go to pointofview.net, because I know Point of View's host, Kirby Anderson, he has talked a lot about this and written about it as well. So many of the so-called solutions that they put forward for climate change, that cost so much money, would actually not really make that big of a difference. And I'm all about protecting the environment. But if we're talking about trillions of dollars of government spending, we need to make sure that it's actually going to do something helpful.
Yeah, and that it's going to be reliable, right? Because in Texas, when you had a 90% failure of clean energy, and there was failure in dirty energy, I guess, gas, but it wasn't in the high degree. It wasn't as pervasive. So you're right. And I just add that a lot of this is self-created problems. We shut down our economy, and now we have to refix it. I'll get back to that after this break. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere, because we are not. We'll be here.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. Thank you for joining us on Point of View today. I am Chelsey Youman, your host. Don't forget to go to Point of View Radio on Facebook, where you can watch us live, comment, like, dislike, whatever you feel the need to do. Or go to pointofview.net, where you can read about the topics we've been discussing today, or advocate, which is new. There's a new feature on pointofview.net that allows you to contact your senators about the Equality Act. I think it's a really important act. Do your research and then advocate. To be active and involved, because that's really the best way to make sure your senators hear from you, is to advocate with them. On the line, we've got Jonathan Teague, and in studio we have Liberty McArtor. We've been talking about this new infrastructure plan, which, to be fair to the plan, it looks like they're thinking they have bipartisan support for the multi-trillion-dollar plan. I'm not sure if that's truly the case or just media talking points. So I'll do more research on that for you guys. But where they're diverging on the support is how they're going to go about funding a $5 trillion plan that they're thinking could stretch into $10 trillion in the next few years. And it's a complete overhaul of everything from rebuilding an infrastructure to they're sneaking in all the clean energy things. I mean, we can expect this to be a really vast, revolutionary program they're looking to implement. And how else are they going to do it? Well, there's the rich tax. So they're going to tax, they're calling it the companies that make over a certain threshold, and then wealthy individuals and wealthy individuals' trusts. So we've been talking about this through the lens of a whole picture, because I think it's really important not to silo ourselves into any one policy, but to look nationwide what's happening. What's happening is we willfully shut down our economy a year ago because of the coronavirus, regardless of partisan support anywhere. That's what happened. The economy crashed. Joblessness rose. Small companies, mid-sized companies, all of those floundered or failed. Then the government said this was a self-caused problem because we shut down, but we're also going to create solutions. They're all going to just be government-run solutions. So we're going to tell you how to operate, when you can operate, and now we're going to do stimulus packages, which is almost $2 trillion stimulus package, and then this. And so for me, it's when the government creates a problem and then the government creates all the solutions. Now this is looking like, to me, a lot of reliance on the government, whether that's for companies to get their stimulus packages, whether that's for now going to be government contracts to execute this massive infrastructure overhaul. For me, that's going to be a cause for concern. I would much prefer to see the free market thriving and alive and well, we all would, but we all have different ideas about how to go about that. So what are some solutions outside of the government, or some thoughts on anything I just said, Jonathan?
Well, that's an excellent question, because I think we've got a lot of, paralysis through diagnosis going on in the culture right now. And so it's going to just become majority kind of wins the day, which is not necessarily what our system really thrives on. Federalism, which is what America is supposed to be, our political model is really supposed to thrive in. A republic democracy, if you will, is designed to foster compromise and coalition. And that's not happening right now. And it would just be so nice if our friends in Washington, D.C. would actually be a little more forward-thinking on that. But if we zero into a 100-foot kind of view here, I think if you want to win the hearts and minds of young adults, for instance, find a way to redeem this narrative and this discussion. What Liberty was saying earlier, I think is so right. I care about the environment. I don't want my kids to grow up in a world that's just entirely pillaged, or worse, has no philosophy around how we steward the creation the Lord's given us. And so I think that's important. It'd be so great to introduce a conversation or a narrative where bills like this or emphases like this have a pinpointed view rather than big, broad strokes. I think a pinpointed view on critical areas of need. President Obama, 10 years ago, was talking about infrastructure repair, and the Democrats have had a congressional mandate 3 times and haven't lifted a finger about it until now. To me, Chelsey, this seems like the ultimate virtue signal of a older president trying to align with where he thinks younger people are. Now, maybe that's a little reductive, but I think that's part of the issue here. But I think if we were to take this from a regional perspective, if we were to get governors and states involved, ask counties what their needs are, and actually take a more comprehensive discussion within the Congress over the next year, Joe Biden's going to be president until 2024 either way. So my question would be, why rush this in the first 150 days when we're trying to defeat the pandemic, get people back to work, kids in school, and get back on our feet into the second and third quarter of the year fiscally. Why now? I would wait a year, get a conference of the governors together, find out the regional needs, and attack it from the bottom up, not the top down.
Well, Jonathan, you bring some really great points. One of them being federalism, which is a topic that I know a lot of us are passionate about, but that would require the Democrats to put a high bar or value on federalism and on local government. And it would require them to, do things like respect the Constitution, which I'm taking some blows here. But the truth is, we have not seen the Democrats be a party of, local solutions or free market solutions. We've seen them be the party of the federal government grows bigger and stronger historically under them. FDR being I don't know if he's the right example of all this, but just a larger federal government. And this is certainly going towards that end. But I love your solution. Would absolutely be putting it back to the states. Liberty, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just that. I love that solution as well, Jonathan. I think bringing federalism back into the conversation is, such a great point. And even, I think we as, Americans and a lot of listeners' point of view being conservatives, we can say, hey, it's not that we don't care about the issues. It's not that we don't care about climate change or we don't care about, helping people out financially who need it right now. But I think, like you were saying, Jonathan, you could really pinpoint all of those issues. You could tackle them at the local level so that they're the most effective for the people in certain regions. But a lot of times you don't see that in Washington. You see one big thing. And right now we're seeing the Democrats do it, especially because they're the ones in power. One big sweeping bill that's going to try to tackle all these things at once, usually with a lot of government spending tacked on. And to me, and this kind of, maybe I'm buying into some of the cynicism we were talking about earlier in the show among millennials. But, to me, it shows that they're not really caring about these issues that they're pretending to care about. It's about pushing an agenda, trying to check the box, say, here's how we get more power. Here's how we, ignore federalism, to Chelsey's point. And so it really does come down to the American people, though, to hold them accountable and to say, well, you may not truly care about these issues, but we do. So, how can we advocate against dangerous bills? How can we speak up for some of these issues to try to make a difference in a non-governmental way and oppose, things that are going to harm us in the future and harm future generations, like massive spending bills?
Right. And I think what this signals to me is we've been in a system now that's continuing to create increased reliance on our federal government to function, to go to our local supermarket, to tell us how to act and behave. And some of that's valid. And then some of it, I would like to see return back to the people, and our economy is one of those things. Some conservative solutions would be things like tax break incentives, actually, instead of taxing those who actually have the money to spend and hire right now. Don't forget, these are the companies that have made it, right? So the companies that are still out there able to hire a few hundred people are now going to be taxed at a rate that they're probably going to have to let some people go. And they're the only ones still hiring and operating. So I would say tax break benefits. So if you're going to assist in these road operations, or if you're going to hire more people, then you're getting tax breaks, and there's an incentive there to do that. But I appreciate both of your perspectives so much. Jonathan Teague, who's a minister to married adults on Prestonwood Baptist Church. You can look him up there. Or Liberty McArtor, who's a freelance writer. I'm Chelsey Youman, your host today at the Millennial Roundtable. I am the state director for Human Coalition Action, where you can read about abortion and politics there. But thanks for joining us today on our discussion, and I hope that you have a great week.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.